Hi, and welcome to a small, medium, at large podcast. I'm your host, Gail, bringing you intimate stories that heal. So, we'd like to welcome David Biedny and David Levitt, digital innovators on fooling each other and ourselves. Let me tell you a little about David Biedny. David is a leading digital effects, graphics, and multimedia expert. He has been a groundbreaking digital artist, author, animator, and effects wizard since the early days of the Macintosh, when he quickly became the world's expert in Photoshop, along with dozens of other software tools. He is the principal author of the official Adobe Photoshop Handbook, and he was soon tapped by Industrial Light and Magic as the Star Wars special effects house began its transition to digital media, contributing to innovative films like Terminator 2, Judgment Day, The Rocketeer, Hook, and Spawn. David Biedny has had several encounters with unidentified airborne objects and unexplained experiences that can only be described as paranormal. At the same time, while he founded the Paracast and Angry Human podcasts back in 2005, he might be considered a skeptic, impatient with the attention seeking and self delusion that dominates so many paranormal claims. At the present time, David Biedny teaches digital media at Yale University. Our second guest, who I personally know, Dr. David Levitt, is CEO of Pantomime Corporation, a creator of uncanny, physically realistic augmented reality using Apple's advanced LiDAR technology. He earned his bachelor's at Yale and his doctorate in artificial intelligence at MIT, creating his first software to improve music in jazz and classical styles. David Levitt was on the founding team of the MIT Media Lab, where he led MIT's entertainment engineering lab focused on real-time media, graphical programming kits, and music. When he joined the team that invented virtual reality at the VPL Research, David Levitt created the first VR worlds with realistic gravity, object collisions, and 3D sound. David Levitt has been a research scientist and product developer at Atari, VPL, Viacom, and Interval Research. He has also taught at NYU and MIT, and he co-founded 3 startups, including Pantomime. He is a frequent speaker at Augmented World Expo, AR/VR Visual Summit, Digital Hollywood, and Games Beat Summit. A lifelong scientist since his teen years at Bell Lab, David Levitt enjoys challenging popular wisdom about gravity and finding simpler and better ways to explain Einstein's theory of general relativity. The husband of Gail, who you all know, is the host of the Small, Medium, at Large podcast. David Levitt is a frequent witness to unexplained phenomena, including clairvoyance, precognition, and remote viewing. Like David Biedny, David Levitt has involuntarily become an expert on how people fool themselves and others. So let's welcome David Levitt and David Biedny here today. And I want to thank my brother-in-law, Peter, because he has suggested for me since the beginning of our show that we need to hear from the other side. We have a lot of guests who are very skilled and knowledgeable in the paranormal, but what about skeptical thoughts about the paranormal? What about people who are charlatans? What about the other side of this? So we're really happy to welcome a couple of scientists here today. Thanks very much and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail.
Well, I like to start off with David Biedny, since I don't know him as well as I know you, David. And I would like to ask him if he could just shed a small little light on what his life was growing up in his family, and if it had anything to do with leading him down the path he's on today, working with media like this.
Wow, that is a comprehensive question, which I will attempt to answer in an abbreviated fashion. So I have this very strange background that involves moving to a different country when I was very young. I spent my formative years from the ages of 11 to 16 in Caracas, Venezuela. And my father had grown up there, had met my mother there a number of years before they actually ended up really getting together in New York. So there's a very kind of a long, complicated family background that I won't get into in detail. Suffice it to say that my cultural upbringing put me in a position of having to become multilingual at a young age, put me into a completely different culture at a young age, which taught me a lot about the culture in which I live now. But also there was an ongoing thread, primarily I suspect due to my mother, that involved what I like to call anomalous activity. I have actually learned to stay away from the term paranormal because of the fact that I find that term tends to take a series of things that are happening and put them outside of the normal, the norm. To me, it's more like these are things we don't recognize, we don't understand, and thus, to me, they're anomalous. And when it comes to anomalous stuff, this is something that had been going on very early in my life, including group experiences with my family, but then a series of things that happened to me alone. And when I started doing the Paracast in 2006, part of that was to try to talk about what I had been through and things I had experienced, seen, witnessed, in many cases with corroborating co-witnesses, just to try to change what I found to be a very frustrating dialogue around these topics that I quickly became aware of what I think is a fact, that a lot of people gravitate to this material as, in essence, a proxy for religious belief. It takes the place in their lives of religious belief. And that is a term I want to just get right on the table, which is believing things and beliefs. I abhor that word. To me, that word has a series of negative connotations. I like to tell people that I don't believe anything. I have suspicions that can be corroborated or disproved. And when you have suspicions, you're more likely to change your stance on something. Beliefs are very hard to dislodge. Suspicions are always open to modification. And I think that's an important part of, and I'll segue into David with this, I think that's an important part of anything that one could reasonably call a scientific method or process. I think people end up thinking that science is some sort of a fixed point in space that everything goes to. And the answer is no, science is a process. It's a process of witnessing something, trying to come up with a hypothesis for what you've witnessed, and now try to create experimental methods to prove the hypothesis. And of course, when we discuss the anomalous, the big problem there is the core thing that we look at in the scientific method, which is consistency and repeatability. In the anomalous, there is no such thing as repeatability. It just simply doesn't exist. And so that realm refuses to play along with our preconceived notions and methods of science. And so I actually find that I exist in a place between the two of you. So if I had not had my experiences, Gail and David, I would be just a core, strict material reductionist, and I would completely, I suspect, ignore all of this stuff. It would be of no interest to me. But unfortunately, as a very intense experiencer, unwittingly, I never asked for any of this. I don't want it in my life. It asserts itself as if to push me in certain directions that, as it turns out, for the most part, have worked out okay in my life. But the point is that I have nothing but questions. That's all that I have. I have no answers. I have lots of questions. And to me, the best questions, or the best answers, are the ones that bring up more questions. That's my stance on this.
One of my feelings is, because I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with quite a few very reputable scientists in these fields, and the one thing that I always come up with at the end of their data and their collections and things is that I feel that some of these things in our life or invisible world or whatever you want to call it are meant to remain as a mystery. And that I feel, I don't like people are searching for a certain answer about why or when or how that happened. But I think some of the things just happen and it's a mystery that's supposed to remain as a mystery. I don't know that I was reading something about you saying that everyone would even be ready to understand what's going on.
I think
And Dave,
right, right. Go
If
ahead.
we had an encounter with an alien, we would be terrified. We wouldn't recognize it was an alien. And sometimes I have an image of meeting smart aliens who found a great way to communicate with me. And I say, finally. And you say, what do you mean, finally? We have all these movies of you saying, got it, and killing another one of our probes or citizens or what have you. If you're not open to it, there's nothing more terrifying and disturbing than something that could have originated from another planet. And it's the last thing that we, despite our Spielberg-esque fantasies, it's the last thing that we actually want to encounter. The first thing we do is shit our pants and grab something in case we need to save our lives.
I think,
Thanks.
well, stop and think about this for a minute. It's not even how in our culture we portray how we would interact with a non-human entity. Think about all of the broadcasts that have left this planet about the insane amount of violence that humans engage in. And already there would be I think, a real distaste for trying to interact with us. But part of that, I think, is that you really have to kind of come down to understand what motivates intelligent life. And, in the case of interacting with humans, I have a strong suspicion that this planet is of interest to other non-human species. And I think that part of that is if one looks at the incredible diversity of life on this planet, an insane diversity of life, the majority of which we have not yet identified. So I think it's important for people to understand when we talk about understanding our own planet, we already know that the vast majority of life on and in this planet, we are completely unaware of. And that's not my opinion. That's someone like Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who passed away in recent years, probably one of the most preeminent biologists in our lifetime, who was on a Bill Moyers episode a number of years ago. And at the very beginning of the episode, Moyers says, well, given that we've discovered most of the life on Earth, and Wilson's like, no, stop. Whoa. No, we haven't discovered the vast majority. And you see Bill Moyers' face. He's like, what do you mean? How much of the life on the planet have we identified? And I'll never forget, Edward Wilson says, well, maybe 10%, maybe 15%. And Moyers is like, what? And I'm thinking, wow. And we're not just, he's largely probably referring to microbial forms of life, but we keep coming up with new species in the oceans. We barely know what's inside of our own oceans. And this is where you start to see, I think, a lack of human honesty, right? So the push to, for example, go and populate a planet like Mars, I have a stock response to that. Every time someone says to me something about populating Mars, and again, you have to kind of take human aspirations and bring them down to something realistic. It's like, oh, you want to go and you want to establish a colony on Mars? Okay, good. First, you have to create at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean a self-contained human base that can function completely autonomously for a year. Once you pull that off, then we can start talking about going to Mars. And I think when we start talking about, for example, understanding the things around us that we can't yet even perceive, much less understand, I think it really behooves us to have a sense of humility, of pragmatic humility, and say, look, we don't understand most of this. And indeed, David, something you said before, which is that I think if we were confronted with the truth of what we are, of the truth of life in the universe, of the truth of life on Earth, I'm 99.9% sure collectively as a species, we couldn't handle it. We just couldn't. We're not ready.
We can barely handle our own political realities with other humans. And when a strange animal comes into our house, which is frequent, I'm happy to say, my first response is to do my best to communicate with it, and trying to make the bat sounds while it circles the kitchen, and there's videos online of everyone is screaming, and I'm like, come this way, don't get trapped in the kitchen or whatever. And just in general, we have mockingbirds that are hilarious, that start doing jazz solos. I don't know if they're influenced by me but they're, and all of the creatures communicating around us that we completely ignore, and then we fantasize that we're going to communicate with alien life when all the hummingbirds that come to our feeder every day are saying, how stupid are these people? Can't they slow down our voices and start a dialogue? Or we never do anything to really communicate with that life that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And, the octopus teacher is just a profound, right? It touches your heart. You realize that they're right there. You put your foot in the water and you almost stepped on one.
And the octopus teacher. So and by the way, when that came out, I was so thrilled, because the octopus is by far my favorite creature on this planet. I think it is easily the most fascinating creature on the planet, as are all encephalopods. But the octopus itself is it's a marvel in every way. And when one studies that life form, you start to get a sense of what life could be like in the rest of the universe, and how diverse it could be. So I want to throw a thought on the table to create a bit of a stir here, because one of the things that I used to do on the Paracast was talk about trying to get to the core signal that's surrounded by the noise, right? And so when we try to understand things that are really complicated and that seem impenetrable, one of the things that I think it's useful to realize is that at the core of everything, there is signal, and that signal has some truth to it, and the truth is there, but then it's surrounded by noise. So a number of years ago, religious fundamentalists co-opted the notion of intelligent design. And this really pissed me off, something fierce, because they claim to not only know that everything is intelligently designed, but they know the motivation of the designer. It's like, just shut up, man. Stop it. Now, all of religion centers around the idea of the creator and the created. I have a different stance on this, and it puts me basically at odds with everyone. It puts me at odds with the atheists. It puts me at odds with the religious people and everyone in between. So I'm going to throw a thing on the table. And this is what I tell my atheist friends, because most of my friends are atheists, but I am not. I'm agnostic, except I'm not even agnostic. I don't fit in any of those boxes. So here's my statement. I'll throw on the table, and I'd love to hear commentary from the two of you. Here's something I don't suspect. Here's something I know for sure. Ready? The universe is intelligent. That's it. Put that out there. I don't know what it's thinking. I don't know what it's doing. I don't know what it's up to, but damn it if it's not intelligent. And I can prove that it's intelligent, because we are a subset of this universe. We proclaim to be intelligent. So do we think that we're somehow intelligent nodes in a completely passive, unintelligent medium? I got all sorts of logical problems with that. Now, where religion steps in then and says, we know what that intelligence is about. The minute people say to me that they know something, I already discredit them. That's where I come from. So in that sense, I am very much a skeptical thinker. On the other hand, Gail, the notion that somehow there is a binary approach to all of this, that you're either a believer or a skeptic, I think that, unfortunately, is very likely a byproduct of a bilateral symmetry brain, where basically everything has got to be A or B, this or that, black or white, good or evil, Republican, Democrat, binary, A, 0, 1. Everything is either this or that. And of course, the truth of all of reality is that everything falls along a gradient. And that's where I think we all get hung up. We all take polar positions without realizing that somewhere the signal in all of that noise is somewhere in between those two. And guess what? It's a moving target.
David, let me and I do present myself as an atheist, partly because I'm a natural born shit disturber, and I know that annoys people more than an agnostic, but also because it captures a great many aspects of my belief. But I totally agree. And if you were to press me, I would say I'm an agnostic, because yes, humility is the key to learning and knowing and discovering. I have to say, the smartest guy I ever met. Did you get to meet Marvin Minsky?
No.
He was the most wonderful, brilliant, improvising lecturer. And at some points in his talks, he would draw a barbell and say, oh yes, they divided that theory into 2 equal parts. I call it a dumbbell theory. And when you first make a theory about something, that's very natural to find 2 of the biggest lumps that have opposing parts and try. But if that's also your last theory, that's the second stupidest theory you could have after, oh, everything is one and God created it. That's not what you really, and politics, boy, the easiest way to fool people in politics is to say there's red and blue, pick one. And it's so damaging, and it's so presumptive. It leaves you in the wrong direction with nowhere to go. And you want to say, in politics, you want to say, oh, here's the 2 groups that are most being influenced by their rich opponent who doesn't have a color or a label. So the ability to dig deeper is the ability to get away from the dumbbell theories to the more interesting theories with 3 and more parts. So yes, I keep Marvin alive. Well, although he might resent me saying he was alive.
Yeah, it can get a little weird there.
But I keep Marvin alive by pointing out that the dumbbell theories are the big obstacles to intelligence.
For our listeners who don't know who Marvin Minsky is, could you please tell them who that is?
So the founder of the field of artificial intelligence, or co-founder with Joe McCarthy from Stanford, who he gives a lot of credit, is Professor Marvin Minsky, who had a long career at MIT and before that Princeton and elsewhere. But back in 1957, he gave birth to artificial intelligence right when the year I was born, and he did it in this clever way where he said we could understand. What if we could understand important parts about how the mind works without dissecting brains, but by making simulations? And there weren't that many digital computers in those days. So he was totally open to analog computers, and he made robots. He spent a whole career making robots and machines that did things that were like human thinking, or like exhibiting what we would call intelligence. And he was so clever in it, and it fits with the theme of the show, because it feels like every field I've found myself in winds up being about illusion. Can you make something that behaves as if it were an intelligent human? And you think that you're endeavoring on a technical project or a biological project or a software project, but at some point it always winds up becoming a psychology project about the person who was fooled. And right before I had the joy of discovering Marvin at MIT, my advisor was a fellow named Joseph Weizenbaum, who had written a program called ELIZA, where you could type, it would say, please state your problem, and you would type,
yeah,
I'm having issues with my mother. And it would say,
how do you really feel about your mother? Yeah.
Well, better, it would say a new content word, tell me more about your family. Yeah. And that's all it had. It's just like a false deal off a magician's deck. People say, oh my God, it understands me. And he was like, wow, this is fun and cool, and I'm impressing all these other nerds. And then his secretary started requesting private sessions with her new therapist. And he said, oh my God, what have I unleashed? And he wrote Computer Power and Human Reason, a powerful book about how we laundered our terrible ideas in so many ways, like Vietnam, by saying, no, the computer said if we slaughter 2 million Vietnamese, we'll win the war. Don't blame us. And and to this day, I mean, it wasn't just last month that someone at Google said, no, this thing I've been having conversations with did come alive, is sentient, is a real thinking being. And you'd think 40 years later, people would know better, but they're so eager to fool themselves and one another that it's like they've learned nothing.
Well, no. And as you know, I've identified, David, I've come to fully suspect that what we're looking at is the thing that actually does differentiate us from all other life on the planet. And I believe that this contains a clue to our origins, an extremely uncomfortable clue. And that theory of mine is that we are unique on this planet in that we are the only species that we know of that is intellectually, emotionally, and I believe physically addicted to deception. I believe humans suffer from an addiction to deception, not a specific form of deception, but the act of being deceived itself, of living in something that is not reality. Now, what makes this really unusual in us is that one could make a very coherent argument that the addiction to deception flies in the face of the instinct for survival. The one thing that we know is common to all life on this planet. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that it's common to all life throughout the universe. We have deceived ourselves, and we engage in proactive deception, even if it means the end of the species. We got to have that hit. We got to have that deception coming at us 24/7. And the sad part of that is that if you, and I admit this could all be biased confirmation. And by the way, I think it's now time for me to make a blanket statement, which is something I'd make at the beginning of all my classes at the beginning of the year. I reserve the right to be wrong at all times. Okay. So I am not infallible. I am just a human being. And one of the things I actually learned from Robert Anton Wilson, someone who all of your listeners should know, Gail, and if they don't know of his work, they should
Not only
look
that,
him up.
but he held our daughter Tasha when she was a baby.
Okay, so
We go to
there you
visit
go.
him, a very lovely man.
I never met Robert Anton Wilson. I really wanted to meet him for years. A huge hero of mine. And something that he has said that he used to say was one of his poor things is the avoidance of the word is. He had a real problem with the word is. And I think that he was onto something there. And so when I hear people go, it is what it is, it's just like, that to me is like somewhere Bob is going, stop it, just stop it. It's like, no, it's not what I meant. And to me, that something is. It's like when you make those definitive statements, what you're doing is basically you are basically swimming in the deception that you know everything, that you're a human, so you're aware. And David, the thing about artificial intelligence that I think is the really uncomfortable part for people who understand what's going on is that you start to realize that one of the things that AI might be showing us is that we're not as complex as we thought we were.
Yeah, it's just quite the opposite. It's look how easily fooled we are, and we do not learn from mistakes or past experience. And fooling humans, when it comes up 11 times a year at least, people say, people trying to generate a soundbite will say, what happens if artificial intelligence takes over our defense weapons systems? And I always think, oh my God, finally, something that has some respect for logic and might actually be able to read parts of the Wikipedia or know history is finally going to be in charge of these incredibly dangerous weapons instead of these ambitious psychotics. And it's about time. Many of the world's problems would be solved very quickly if it's funny, I worked on a project with some people putting some of Chomsky's ideas which are already in the Wikipedia in form of semantic networks into computers. And it's like, yes, if people who actually knew something about history and politics, or non-people who knew something about flawed humans were actually running these systems, they would say, you know what, first thing we're going to do is make sure none of those people ever touch them again. And the computers are much more likely to save us than to make us their slaves, like so many people fantasize.
They're just tools in the end. And we often will, in our addiction to deception, will assign more inherent value or reality to the tools, and maybe we should, because the best tool in the world kind of needs to have the hand of a driver. Otherwise, it's potential. I think that when you talk about artificial intelligence, I submit that we don't really yet understand intelligence. It's kind of like Uncle Ray Kurzweil, who at one point I really admired, I respected. Then I realized he
You should
completely.
tell people, Gail, he was well known, along with Robert Moog. He's probably the foremost inventor of synthesizers, maybe 2 decades after Robert Moog. And many
So
of the
Moog invented the analog synth in many ways. Ray Kurzweil actually was more about the sampled keyboard, the sample piano thing. But then Ray also had a speech typewriter. Ray is a brilliant cat, but Ray is a guy who also is the one behind the notion of the singularity. That Ray in his mind thinks that somehow we'll be able to digitize human consciousness, digitize it, and put it into computer circuitry, which to me is so ridiculous because it assumes that we have any grasp on what consciousness is, which we're not even close. We have no clue at this point to the nature of consciousness. And I think that we all need to be very clear on that. We're not just talking about artificial intelligence, but let's get back onto Gail's podcast topic. Really talking about the unknown, right? The unknown. The idea that, for example, we understand the nature of consciousness, that we understand what's alive. And I contend that not only do we not, if we were confronted with the actual range of types of intelligence in this universe, we would curl up into balls and hide under our beds. Because, for example, I just give you one example. I have a strong suspicion. Now, here, I'm going to put something out there. It's completely nuts. And the material reductionists are going to hear this, and their heads are going to explode. I hear their brains crackling like popcorn in a microwave, right? Don't say that, Biedny. I see no reason not to suspect that a star in the sky, I have no reason to think it could not be a sentient and intelligence. I see no reason to think that it wouldn't be. In fact, I could put out there that without the star in the sky doing what it does, there'd be no life on this planet, there'd be no humanity, there'd be no podcast, there'd be no nothing. And if that star extinguishes tomorrow, 8 minutes later, there ain't nothing left here. So why not put out that, hey, the star spawned the stellar system around it. The star has a birth process. It has children. The children live, they die, they come, they go through cycles. The star has a life cycle, and at a certain point, the star explodes, and the remnants of that star go on to form, the iron in our blood. So who's to say, right?
I have to interrupt here about the star thing.
Yeah.
I'm not good at remembering quotes, but David might remember it. Timothy Leary's last words that he spoke on his deathbed have to do, do you remember the quote, David, where he said, "We are all the stars, and this is where we will meet again, is in the stars." I do something like that. Do you remember, Dave?
It's like that. People seem to, especially at end of life, they seem to see it's even there in 2001. It's all stars. They're looking out there and they're seeing their origin and their destination.
But I do want to take us onto another little vein here, because we want to keep our listeners onto the topic that I'd like to discuss with you, which is your paranormal experiences. Because I like when people share something that was, I agree with you that there are experiences that you have had that are real for you. And there are also a lot of people out there who are like charlatans that are saying all these different things that we don't know where they're really coming from or what's really going on. And people follow lots of different people who get up there on a stage and they play on the emotions of people who've lost someone who's passed away. So we know about these things. What I'd like to know about is what experiences you had in the paranormal that I don't know if that affected any of your work when you did special effects, or I know you say you don't want them, but you seem to have them. And I know people who are spending every day wishing they could have an out of body experience. And I always tell them, I always was trying to learn how to get in my body because I was always out of body. So if you could share a little bit about that. And then David, if you have anything to say about any paranormal things, let's hear what David Biedny has to say first.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to get the question a little more targeted, because as you might have read, Gail, I mean, I have had major anomalous experiences.
So there's one about your mother that I was hoping you would share.
Okay. So part of the complexity of my growing up was that my mother was a powerful psychic. And she was someone who was a psychic who clearly could not control it, really. She tried at times to control it. And I have memories of things she would do in the house to play these games with me and my brother. I'll give you one example. She would have this little game. We were living in a house in New Jersey, in Somerset, New Jersey. And she would sit in the kitchen and she would say to me and my brother, she would say, hey, go run into the house, grab something small, put it in your pocket, and then come back to the kitchen. And we'd scatter, we'd go run some room or somewhere, and we'd go look for something, find things, put them in our pockets, and we run back to the kitchen. And she'd be sitting there at the kitchen table, like with her eyes kind of closed. And she'd go, you got this. And it'd be like, the fuck did she know that? And so she would like guess what we had in our pocket. And one time that this happened, I remember I said to my brother, was younger than me, 3 years younger than me. So I say, hey, Barry, go run. I'm going to hang out here. I'm like, go run. I want to see what happens. Does she come after us or something? So she had us go do this. And I'm like at the kitchen door outside looking at her. And she's just sitting at the table, like doing this thing where she's got her eyes. It's almost like she's following us, but like with her eyes closed, she's like following us, taking the turns with us. And this absolutely flipped me out. I was like, what the hell is going on here? So it was one of these situations where my mother had this one, she had 2 strokes. The second stroke killed her. The first stroke she had in her doctor's office, the only reason she lived. And after that, the stroke seemed to kill part of her brain, that where a lot of her anger, a lot of her negativity, a lot of the bad stuff in her seemed to be stored. And all of a sudden, for the last year and a half of life that I had my mother, she was really my mother. And anything, when she had the second stroke and passed away, I was pissed off that I only get her for a year and a half like that. And now she's gone, mother. Like, you son of a bitch. But what she and I talked about after her first stroke was, hey, Mom, if there is any way for you to give me some sign of continuance of ego post-mortem, try to find out what you can do. And I'm not going to go into the whole story here, Gail, because I will give you a link to share with your listeners to an episode of the Paracast where I go into all of the detail of this. Suffice it to say that in the end, my mother gave me something I asked for. She gave me unquestionable, definitive, physical evidence of the permanence of identity post-mortem. And that was it. I knew that my mother remained who she was in terms of a spiritual entity. It's because of her insane psychic ability that she was able to do this thing that was really, really kind of just impossible. And the kind of thing that, had anybody told me the story that this had happened to them, frankly, especially not having had, if I had not had any of my experiences, I would have just instantly discounted them and gone, oh yeah, whatever. But I went through this with her right after her death, and it left me with no question that in some form her identity, who she was, persisted. And then, without going into the long story, I am now living in my dream home, this wonderful, incredible place that I acquired in an insane real estate market. I got a place that in a normal market would be a unicorn. In a tough real estate market, just an impossibility. And what I'll tell you about this, and this is something I've certainly not spoken about publicly, really. Some of my closer friends I've told this, and they're like, oh, you're definitely nuts, man. You're insane. My mother identified, this is now years and years later, she's been gone for a number of years now. My mother identified that I was going to want to buy a house before I had any clue that I knew I was going to buy a house or even wanted it. She identified this desire in me. She found a place that couldn't be better located in terms of geographical location. She found a property that would be like something that I couldn't believe would be mine. She kept it off the market for 8 months. She made one sale after another, mysteriously fall through. And the owners were like, what is going on? In this market, this house isn't sold in a day? What? And so they actually took it off the market for a few months, trying to reassess. They end up putting it back on the market in the middle of their night. Their brain damaged real estate agent lists this thing at like 2 o'clock in the morning. One night when I'm looking completely despondent, I'm not going to find anything. And I happen upon the pictures and I'm like, what is this? And I'm looking at this and I look at where it is and I'm like, what? No, this is impossible. Oh. And this is like 2:30 in the morning. I'm like, Mom, if you could ever do this again, Mom, please, Mom, this would be the time, Mom. If you could ever pull a stunt like that thing you did when you died, Mom. God damn it, she wasn't already on the case. She was already on it. And I ended up with not just a home. I ended up with something that completely changed my life, removed years of depression and anxiety that were becoming, quite frankly, overbearing, vanished overnight, evaporated, boof, gone. And so I now live in the second incident my mom caused, which is now the most significant anomalous event in my life. I live in it. So this is
sometimes people refer to what you were describing, that when she died, some people refer to that as a consciousness living on. And this last year, $500,000 was awarded by this Mr. Bigelow to Jeffrey Mishlove, who had written a paper about proof beyond bodily death. And a lot of people refer to it as people's consciousness. Some people refer to it as spirit. What do you feel your mother has come to you as? Do you think this is her spirit of her soul or the spirit of herself? Or do you think that, you know that you've had communication with her? And does that communication come sometimes in the voices? Do you hear voices in your head and you know it's your mother? What is the experience, or have you only interacted with her twice in all these years, and it was once at the death and once at this house where she appears and helps you?
I don't know how to answer any of the above. So I don't try to encapsulate what has happened into some existing preconceived notions of mine. Right. And this was part of what I had discussed with her before she died, that I knew she had some abilities. This was something well known in the family, by the way, and not completely understood.
And she was not an American, right? She wasn't born here.
My mother was a German national who ended up being a nationalized American citizen. So I'm first generation American. So my mother was a Holocaust survivor, which puts a pretty weird, sort of an overlay on all of this. But all that I actually asked her for, and so I didn't have terminology to present any of this to her. I wanted to know that who she was, as call it a consciousness. I think, there are terms here that are kind of interchangeable: consciousness, spirit. I think, they're kind of the same thing. And if there's a distinction, I'm unaware of it, because this is not my realm of specialty. I'm a technologist. To me, this is all kind of a little gooey. And so what my discussions with her was to basically show me that you don't just, the atheist material reductionist view of the world is that you close your eyes. Basically, they believe that consciousness is a byproduct of neural activity. I don't buy that at all. I think it's pretty clear it's not, in fact. And my mother was able to prove to me that her consciousness was very much her consciousness, and that it persisted her awareness of her as my mother seemed to persist, her connection to me persisted. And quite frankly, I'm in a unique position that, yeah, and I realize when I say this that some number of people who know me and know how I approach things would hear this and go, well, all right, so David is now completely snapped. And maybe they're right. I don't know. Maybe that's true. And, here's something I would say to them and something I say to myself all the time. Given the range of anomalous experiences I've had and the extreme nature of some of them, the ones that are the most extreme ones are ones I've never spoken about publicly because I can't, because I don't have corroborating witnesses. When I don't have corroborating witnesses, I'm a lot less likely to talk about something because I'm aware of what the human mind is capable of. I'm aware how we can perceive and alter reality around us based on our limited visual, auditory perceptions of reality. When I teach students how to approach digital imaging, for example, and the whole idea of believing what their eyes show, I believe it. I see what I believe what I see. It's like, don't believe your eyes. And so there are a few examples I show them, some color correction examples where there's a checkerboard and there's a green cylinder casting a shadow on the checkerboard. And so you see two different checks of two clearly different colors. One is white, one is gray. There's no way they're the same. One is in shadow, one isn't. And so their eyes are going, well, clearly those two checks are not the same shade of gray. One's white, one's almost black. And I then show them right there on a Photoshop screen that those two checks that their brain and their eyes are telling them is so obviously not the same shade of gray. I move them on top of one another and they're like, wait a minute, what did you just do? And I drag this on the screen so there's no sleight of hand. And they're like, what are you doing? And it's like, I want you to understand that just because your eyes are giving you information doesn't mean that information is accurate. Your eyes tell you clearly those can't be the same. And I'm just showing you they're exactly the same. So what am I telling them? Question what your eyes are telling you. Don't always believe what your eyes see because your eyes are imperfect. And indeed, if we understand nature or reality around us, and we're just going to use our senses, this is where the scientist part comes in. It's good to have a handle on what the limitations of our senses are, to know how much stuff is going on around us that we can't perceive. If it's happening in infrared, we don't see it. And there's a ton of stuff happening around us. We don't see it. If we don't see it, it's not happening. Well, yes, it is happening. And I think there are clues to understanding the nature of reality when you approach it from that tangent.
I want to say that I really understand what you're saying about you don't want to share some of your stories because you didn't have a witness. And having David Levitt come into my life, I finally had the witness I needed to be there laying next to me in bed or in a car or wherever it is that some of these things that I experience, he watches them happen. And it gives me some kind of supportive feeling like I'm not the only one that was there, and it really backs me up. And I have been in relationships with some people where even when they see it happen in front of them, they deny it to me and say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. That never happened, even though it really did happen. But they tell me maybe a year later, yeah, what you said was true, but I didn't want to tell you. David's the first man I've been with who is happy to say when he thinks this isn't credible or this is credible. And because of him, I ended up being in this world of scientists I never would have met on my own. So I want to just say how grateful I am to have a David Levitt to be able to witness the things that happen and for him actually to remember them because so many happen that I forget.
Well, and conversely, I am much as Jeffrey Mishlove trumpeted. I am a materialist, a skeptic, frequently an atheist of sorts, and but I also, I'm a curious scientist fundamentally. And when, as a teen, I encountered Robert Monroe's Journeys Out of the Body, I was like, God, it really sounds like this happened to him. And I was not the kind of skeptic, the Penn Jillette type skeptics that's just trying to scalpel, destroy whatever thing he just heard and disprove it. But there, when I wake up next to you and you're saying, God, I was having the strangest dream about our housekeeper son vomiting. And then the phone rings 1 minute later and she says, I can't come in today. My son is vomiting. I can't ignore these things. And when
I try to keep you interested with more of them.
and when I'm sitting in the kitchen and the phone rings, and I mean, well, there's several layers of implausibility when the phone rings and it's a psychotherapist saying, I have a patient here with me. I know from your manuscript, The Small, Medium, at Large, that what you're capable of sometimes. I have a patient here whose mother is missing. Would you mind talking to him? And you're like, I mean, it's the most charming thing when she says, why? Or shouldn't, if she really wants to talk to a psychic, there's the psychic squad, and there's people who actually do this. I don't do this. And he says, he's right here in my office. Would you?
One of the things
I'll need a few seconds at a certain point because I kind of lose it. This is a true story. His mother is missing. He wants to talk to Gail for reasons none of us understand, except that his psychotherapist suggested it. And the first thing that goes through her head is, well, and I hear her asking, was your mother okay? Did she have cancer? He says, no, I think she was healthy. She was blah, blah, blah. Long story short, Gail puts the guy on hold and says, I see his mother, a woman in a vehicle with a bunch of boulders, dead in the front seat. And I don't know how to tell him this. I don't want to tell him this. But she tells the psychotherapist, and long story short, and then she asks the guy, do you think she's alive or dead? And he says, I think she is gone. And you should trust your feelings. And then the therapist gets back on the phone and she says, I didn't know how to tell him this. Long story short, the police find her body in exactly the condition that she described. And next thing you know, they're asking her, was there foul play? And you realize, and she's starting to get confidence and says no. And sure enough, they find the suicide note, and it's monoxide, and she did have cancer. And Gail's very first question was exactly on the money. And it's pointless to ask how she does this, except
I'm washing dishes when this phone call came in. It's not like I go to any premeditative position and say, all right, I'll get back to you. It's just instantaneous on a telephone.
and
He's my witness.
So yeah, so I get to witness these things, and I'm not the sole witness. It's so funny, but by the way, do you know who David do you happen to know who Dick Schaub is? There was a guy back in the era of analog who invented what's now known as blue screen matting.
So, there are like 4 people who are claiming this. Blahos, and now this guy, and I know
He got an Oscar for it.
Well, okay, Blahos also I'm a little unclear on the
maybe it was
lineage of
Emmy.
blue screen and green screen, but go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, so he wound up being one of the geniuses at interval research that Paul Allen hired in the early 90s to do new, unusual things with his, being the world's 3rd richest man, in a secret lab in Palo Alto. And I had the delight and honor of being there too. And Dick was particularly interested in what we like in the anomalous, if you will, and wound up bringing in Russell Targ and Dean Radin. And they were like, gee, we have sort of a secret lab. This is maybe the secretest project in some sense. But we really would love to get volunteers for these and I had probably just woken up from 1 or 2 of these experiences with Gail. I said, would someone like that be good? And the next thing you know, they say, yeah, bring her in for an interview. Well, sure enough, our niece, who now lives in the next town, said, oh my God, Auntie Gail has been doing this since I was a kid. And the next thing you know, she's got a whole dossier called Psychic Auntie Gail of all the third-party witness things she's did. And the next thing you know, Gail is being interviewed by these scientists in Palo Alto, and their jaws are on the floor. They're saying, A, we're so mad we didn't record this. B, you have to write a book. And C, how can we put you in the next experiment we do? And they had all of these very successful experiments.
Well, because of David, my whole world changed because of the people that he worked with and what went on at Interval Research. And it opened up doors to me to meet some of the most interesting people and learn all these different other things that were going on in the psychic field or whatever. But enough about me. And
no, but yeah, the most serious efforts among scientific people, Dean Radin, and he's a model in many ways. And Russell, and I'm there frequently when Russell Targ calls up and says, a little bit like your mom. He's very much like your mom in the sense that they'll just say, "So Gail, what am I holding in my hand?" And God damn it, she's usually got it, and and within seconds. And is it in front of you? I don't. Is the don't show it yet? But she says it's gold. It's metal. It's kind of heart shaped. It's and she says the funniest thing of all. She says all of the elements are the same length. And now pull it out.
I forget what to call it.
A Euclidean solid, and icosahedron.
Russell always sends me the object after I have a whole collection of objects here he sends after I remote view them.
And she just does that, and she's done it in public in front of 70 people, and they all turn around and like trying to figure out who the shill is who made up because she says what's in the bag and she's never seen it, and Russell never had it the day before.
To sort of reiterate what David Biedny was saying, anytime someone asks, I tell them, I don't know how I know this. I don't know how the picture pops up in my head, or I don't know how I hear the information or where it comes from, this information. I just sort of feel that I just step out of the way and the information comes through. And I also agree with something that I read that you had said, David, on one of your sites, David Biedny, that you were thinking when people were asking, where do you think this is coming from? One of the few things that I think is information is that there does seem to be some sort of family hereditary genetic something about some of these so-called gifts or whatever words you want to use for this. It does seem to be passed down. And when you start talking to people about it, then all of a sudden they remember and they say, oh, my Aunt Gladys, she was like that. Or, oh, my Uncle Fred. Yeah, and we didn't want to talk about it because it wasn't good in church, or, whatever the things that come up, you find that people will then reach back and realize that they had been exposed by some particular family member. But I wanted to, we're getting close now. This is our hour that we've started, but what I want to talk about a little bit also is about the two of you and how the two of you have a friendship. I believe it's a very long-term friendship the two of you have. How long have you two Davids known each other?
So I'm pretty short, and I was thinking about this, David. I remember way back when, I don't know what the context was, but I was on a trip visiting some people at the MIT Media Lab. I was in Cambridge, and I was there. The Media Lab was in Cambridge, correct?
Sure.
Right. Okay. So I was in that building, and I'm walking down a hallway with some people, and in my mind, this is what I remember. There was a glass wall or window to an office, and on that window, there was a dot matrix printout of the face of Bob Dobbs from the Church of the And I'm walking down the hallway, and I see the Bob Dobbs head, right? Was this on your office wall? Was it
probably one of my students?
Right.
But no, it's probably the laboratory that I created for doing
there was a Bob Dobbs head there, and I'm like, wait a minute, and I like opened the door, and you were sitting there. You're the first person, like, Bob Dobbs, and then you were like, sub genius,
and I was already a minister.
That being the connection.
Okay, well that's important.
But I reserve the right to be wrong at all times. What do you remember?
It might have been that same day. And by the way, I discovered I discovered Bob by finding in a poorly constructed office intended for equipment, not people, but because I was on a fellowship, that got to be my office. And behind the light switch was a fortune cookie size note that said, explore your reincarnality. Powerful lust reversions eliminated or implanted. Send $1 to an address in Dallas for hilarious tract. I couldn't part with $1 any faster than that. And the next thing you know, I was a minister. It's a long story. But what I remember about that day is all of these incredible, I mean, part of it was they were doing Macworlds in Boston during this period.
That's what I was up for, a Macworld Expo, because I used to speak at them all. So one of the founding editors of Mac User magazine. So I used to come up. I'd never missed a Macworld.
And the parties were legendary. And Todd Rundgren, of all people, had made his own object-oriented operating system that was beyond anything Apple had ever come up with.
Todd was, yeah.
All of this absurd stuff would happen. And a bunch of you, David Shargell, you, 2 computer music guys had all crowded into my office at the media laboratory we had just built. And it was kind of a funny moment because someone stuck their head into the office and said, Dave, and all 6 of us turned around. There was no one in the room not named Dave. And that was the beginning of the magic. Yeah. But yeah, that Macworld community was huge.
It must have been a Mac. So that was it. It was Macworld, because then you mentioned David Shargell, who was took my place at I got him the gig at Mac User when I left. I was the technical editor of Mac User at that point. I bailed out, had a fight with Felix Dennis, told him to go fuck himself, left. Recommended David for the gig, so he came in as technical editor, and that must have been after. So this goes back a long way, but it's weird, David, because what I also remember is when I connected with you that time, it's kind of like one of these friendships, and I've had multiple of these in my life, where you don't feel like you're meeting somebody, you definitely feel like you're picking up an old conversation.
Yeah, yes.
There's a familiarity.
Visiting your home planet, yes.
Yeah, and I think that also is, quite frankly, something that to me points to this reality of continuance. I think that, people talk about soulmates or friends forever. I think there is something about that when you meet people who you identify with from outside of this construct, there is some sense of recognition, and you can never put your finger on it. And that's something, by the way, in this life, I've come to strongly suspect there are a lot of things that we don't have access to. So the notion of everybody wants to know what comes after death, what happens when we die. And it's like, well, I think I've come to realize that you're not supposed to know, because if we all knew, we wouldn't want to be here anymore. We want to get the hell out of here, be jumping off of buildings like every day. People just be like self-terminating, like, what am I doing here? The realm of pain? Fuck, give me the realm of reality. Let me wake up out of this dream back into the larger reality. But I think that time spent here the physicality is about intensified learning, because that is something I do strongly suspect, that we're here to learn. And who we're here to learn for? I don't know. Maybe the universe. I have this vision in my head where you go through your death and whatever, and now you're facing the universe, and you go to the universe, what does it all mean? And the universe looks at you and goes, well, I was hoping you'd have some insight to that. What did you think you were doing? Enjoying yourself? Like, what did you learn? Come on, give it up. We need more information for the program. Go back and get some more this time. Would you focus this time, please? We're going to send you to the planet with chocolate oceans and nymphomaniac mermaids. Let's see what you can do. Because in my mind, that planet exists, and that's where I'm going next. That's the deal. I don't care if I suffocate. What a way to go.
What a way.
This is you and David both have this connection in this sort of realm of planet and UFO things. And I've been telling David since we've been married for 20 something years that when the ship lands and he's leaving, that he has to let me know that we'll just have a biplanetary relationship, because I like to be on the earth.
The only place probably chocolate exists. So I'm going to lay something on the show here.
Yes.
I'll lay something on the show here. David, it's something you said before about, you have an experience and you get real scared, right? Like if you were to meet an alien, what would really be the reaction ultimately? let's say you were in a situation where you're out in the woods, the craft lands, and the creature comes off of it. If you're a normal human being, as in if you're any human being, your reaction should be extreme fear. This whole notion of, oh, the space bugs are here, I'm going to go hug them. That is not how the human body works. The human body is confronted with that kind of thing, and you are really scared. So there was an incident that happened to me in South America. I simply do not talk about, never talked about on the Paracast, never talked about it anywhere. But what I'll say is this: in that experience, I underwent the most terrifying time of my life. To think about it is for me to probably not sleep tonight. Any kind of thought about it will mess with my sleep patterns. I have repressed memories of an event that was so incredibly terrifying. And when people say, oh, I wish I could meet an alien, it's like, no, you don't. That's the last thing you want to have happen. Just like, I wish I could see a full body apparition. No, you don't. They'll scare you to death. And something that I went through in Florida with a friend of mine, where we witnessed a full body apparition in daylight outside. This girl, it looked like a girl, wasn't an actual girl, was something else. And where her eyes and her mouth were was just darkness in daylight. It was terrifying. And then we watched this thing, this girl, whatever it was, dematerialize right in front of us. And we're like, what is happening? Now, we talked about that episode in the Paracast. Bill Vellacoop, my childhood friend, came on the show, backed up the story in extreme detail, and people thought we were kind of goofy. And it's like, look, I can't tell you what we saw. I don't know. It wasn't a girl the way you think of it. Point being that was it. I didn't sleep for days after that episode. Bill and I were up just like losing our mind after that. But the thing that happened in Venezuela was much more extreme. And here's the only thing I will share from it. And I'm about to put myself into a shitload of hot water by even bringing this up. So, I got to give you something that I never talked about before. So, all right. I had an incident where I had the occasion of posing a question to a non-human entity. I don't even know what the question was, because the entire episode is wrapped in lost memory and extreme, profound, soul-tearing, agonizing fear. For those of you who want this episode, you want this experience, no, you don't. You don't ever want this to happen. It will fuck your life up. So, some question I posed to this thing that was even entertaining questions from me. And I'll tell you what the answer was. And the answer to me was very revealing. The answer was, do you think only humans lie?
Oh.
And that, to me, told me so much. And maybe that's where my theory about the addiction to deception might somehow be tangentially connected to that experience. But I realized at that point, people are confronted with things they don't understand, and then they're told things. Something came to me in my dream and told me something. It looked like your mother, really? So you believe because it looked like your mother, it was your mother or your father that came to you in the dream because it looks like them, because it told you something that it thinks you want to hear, that it's your parents somehow. And this is where I think that we are very malleable creatures, too malleable.
Did you have, I know you don't want to talk about the experience, but there's one question, because I happen to agree with you on this subject, and I've been on a guest on other people's shows that they're very into the UFO thing. And I never even, my experience was in my late 20s, and I never wanted to talk about it ever. And it's only been in this recent last year or so that I've talked about it, because to me, it was a terrifying thing that I had nobody to validate whether this was really real, but it involved things being done to my body and me being like sort of taken away, even though my body was laying in the bed. Like part of me went up into this experience with these, what you would call aliens or things, but there was a lot, I felt like I was being sexually probed and having very strange sexual things happening at the time of this experience. And it was so weird and out of everything that I never really talked about it till I've been on some of these shows and I've heard these people, because I've always wondered why the image I saw was an image you see in movies of the standard alien look with the almond eyes and the gray body. And then I come to find that there's these whole people who, oh, they're into the grays and they want these experience. I mean, sorry, and I didn't want that experience, but someone had told me about UFOs and things. So I decided to just sort of say, well, is that real? And after I asked the question, I had the experience. And then I said, I don't ever want this experience ever again. And it has never happened again. But I also felt like I needed some closure or some validation or something. So by listening to some of these other shows I've been on, when I hear some of the other guests talk about some of the experiences, I've heard some things that sort of felt like what might have happened with me. And it made me feel a little weirdly comforted, or I don't know what the right word is, less anxious. But my approach is the same as you. I've just never wanted to have anything to do with that.
So the whole subgenre of experiences that you're talking about now, that is a very well-known trope in UFO abduction scenarios. And this is one area where I remain in a bit of a gray basket, because one of the things, as you start to sort of drill down into human psychology and how we parse experience, is that very often different forms of trauma will be wrapped up in these wrappers in our brain to make our brain be able to deal with them. So anytime that the minute I hear any kind of a crossover into sexuality being involved with these things, one could make a simple determination that much like we would be on some other planet, looking at the biology and what are things we're interested in. Well, reproductive biology gives us a huge insight into how a species evolves. I could see there being a scientific approach on their end, but I want to put something out there that I think is really important, and it's one of the more unpopular notions of mine that I put forward on the Paracast that got a lot of pushback, but I think it's actually something that we need to just mention here briefly. If my theory about the human addiction to deception has any reality to it, it seems to me that if there was a creature that lived on this planet along with us, let's just play a what if game for a minute. Let's say that humans, unbeknownst to us, were not the top of the food chain on the planet. Let's just say that for a moment. Let's say there was something here that was older than us, maybe had something to do with our evolution. Maybe that addiction to deception might have been something that some crypto species might have tried to do to us to control us. Maybe they implanted that in us. Maybe it got away from them. Maybe that happened. I don't know. I have no idea. But if that were the case, then if that creature were here with us, it would be very convenient for them to get us to believe that these craft we saw in the sky were extraterrestrial. They're little aliens. So they come, they do stuff, and then they leave, and then they're gone, and then that's fine. And I think to myself, okay, so we got these little small diminutive grayish beings with large dark eyes. Large dark eyes, really big eyes that seem to be really, really big photon collectors. Where would big photon collectors be really useful? Well, I don't know, maybe a star with much dimmer light than Earth, or I don't know, maybe underground where there's no light. Maybe they're kind of small because kind of like a rodent or a mole, large scale isn't really useful. Maybe small scale is really useful. Maybe the long time, the mythology of the lizard creatures. And again, remember, I'm always looking at the huge ball of noise to get to the core of signal. Maybe there's something about that whole reptilian thing that's not completely nuts. Maybe there's an alternate set of evolutions that occurred concurrently with human evolution. maybe some advanced form of dinosaur adapted to life underground, attempted to repopulate the surface by manipulating the million species that arose after the great extinction. Listen, is any of this plausible? I don't know. It's as plausible as a Jesus figure, maybe even more so.
Yes, let's say that we know even less about what's going on in the layers between us and the core of the earth than we do about the ocean, which is
No, we know nothing. We basically know nothing. We know nothing. All we have are theories. We've never actually penetrated below, I think, 9 miles down.
And the crazy thing, 12 miles down, supposedly it's hot enough to provide all the power humans on the surface would ever need, but no one's gone there.
So who's to say these things didn't happen? Who's to say underneath of all of the ridiculous mythology, there is a signal core that is truth? And if we were that species, and I'm just saying might exist, maybe they figured out how to do a number of things. Maybe, in fact, they have figured out how to manipulate matter to the extent where they can change their physical appearance. Wow, that's crazy. Well, seems crazy, except that I have a series of experiences in my life that go back to my early 20s that would seem to strongly indicate that that is more than a distinct possibility. I only ever accidentally referred to one of those experiences on the Paracast one time, and then the listeners would never leave me alone about it. But that one was one that shook all of my belief systems that I had up until that time, shook them all to the core. And I had a series of ongoing experiences with something that I don't know what it was. Tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't a human being.
Let me ask you
Definitively not.
something right here.
Yeah.
There are some people that I've heard on these different podcasts who feel that whether we want to call it aliens or I don't have the word for whatever it is, other beings or planetary influences, that they feel that they're coming here to help us because our world is in such a disaster. And I don't know.
The planet's fine. The species is fucked. The planet's fine.
Mhm.
And sorry, that you see, to me, when people start saying that, they're here to save us. Grow up. That is the same desire for the infinitely forgiving, non-judgmental parental figure. Every belief in God comes down to mommy save me, daddy save me, make it all feel better, make the bad people go away, take all the pain away, tell me everything's gonna be fine.
What about the downloads that people talk about, that they think that some of the technology we have today and the information, that this really didn't come from, people like you and David, it really came from information that got downloaded from these. I'm just saying, these are things I hear. I just
Don't give away our secrets, David.
No. Here's another one never been told. Here's a story for your podcast, never been told. You're going over time, but trust me, this will be worth it. This is a good one.
Great.
So while we're doing the Paracast, and I'm putting out my thoughts about the concept of reverse engineer technology, which to me is abject nonsense, the way it's portrayed, it's an impossibility. So someone who's listening to the show contacts us. Now watch how I play this pronoun game. You're going to love this. Someone approaches the show, and this person says to us, listen, been listening to the show. I appreciate the stance you're taking. I need to talk to you about my father. So what is this person? I'm going to give you the short version of the story. This person claims to myself and my former co-host, who of course, like everything else in the Paracast, he couldn't pay attention to it because he couldn't pay attention to anything outside of selling ads behind my back. But that's why I left the show. Let's not go there. Forget that stuff. I wasn't into doing this for any money. To me, when people have a profit motive around these topics, I instantly distrust them. That moment I see profit motive, they've already lost all credibility in my eyes. So
no profit motive here on this podcast.
Excellent. Okay. Most podcasts cannot make that claim about these topics. Okay, so this person approaches the show. and provides us the following story and proof to back this up. This person says that their father was an engineer in a major aeronautics company connected to the military. And that this person's father, for about 30 years or so, worked in a lab and would not talk about their work. This person is now on their deathbed. The father's on the deathbed, and his father tells his family that, in fact, at his job, what he's been doing is attempting to figure out how to activate the power source on some form of retrieved non-human tech, implying it was a craft. And this person had access, the scientist, engineer, had access to some portion of this craft, couldn't see his coworkers because they were all kept completely separate, compartmentalized. So there was no overlap. For about 30 years, this guy's sole objective was to, and I qualify this, figure out how to turn on the power supply. Where's the on button for the damn thing? 30 years. Was no closer at the end of those 30 years to figuring it out than he was at the beginning of those 30 years. Now, a couple of things. This person who approached us proved that their father was indeed who he said he was. I have the paperwork on this guy. And it was real. So I knew this person wasn't just inventing this father figure. A. B, it completely made sense to me that they would have never figured anything out. So imagine
compartmentalizing alone would I mean, people think they're being smart when they come and go on.
Right. So right there, or maybe you're losing the battle. But imagine for a minute if we took a laptop back on the same planet, same species, 300 years. I take a laptop back 300 years with a battery that's not in there. So they got to hook it up to electricity somehow and figure out how to turn it on. Good luck. Take the smartest human on Earth 300 years ago, hand them a laptop. In fact, give them a laptop with a charged up battery in it. See how far they're going to get with it. Not very far. So the idea that somehow we have reverse engineered tech, the minute anyone says that, whether it's Bob Lazar, who's completely full of shit, or any of the other people who claim that any of this happened, it shows a profound ignorance in how technology works. And I'm sorry, this is yet again where science can say there is a very linear development in the case of the IC chip, in the case of the transistor. We can start, you start with vacuum tubes and move all the way through to the IC. And, the Apollo mission is what provided a lot of the impetus for us to invent a lot of technologies that we now take for granted. Hey, man, what good was going to the moon for? You enjoy your mobile, you like your smartphone? Thank the Apollo mission for that. Understanding the history of science and technology is to understand that there were no external interventions like that in our time. None of that happened. So the minute anybody makes that claim, I already know where they're coming from. They're basically peddling a nonsensical, irrational narrative that makes sense in no universe, much less this one.
By the way, especially since we haven't touched on it, but I think it's important and it's one of the things we have in common. The ability to resist peer pressure is something that you and I have in common. That is, I think you're correct about there's a part of our brain that knows how to turn off logic and turn on, I'll have what she's having. And part of it is built in. And part of it is a survival mechanism for social species. And for Americans, tragically, part of it is 70 years of every 6-year-old and up being told, when you get the signal, put your hand on your heart and claim that you believe what the person next to you believes, whether there's any truth to it or not. And we're so well trained in that and it comes ridiculously from the McCarthy era in the 50s, where again, part of the reason I say I'm an atheist is like saying I'm black. You could make arguments that I'm 51% right, but no, I want to be on the oppressed people's side, and I don't want anybody. I mean, part of the reason I don't encounter any bigots is that everybody knows not to pull that shit with me because half of them don't know what I am, and some of them are a little pissed off that how could you have been Jewish on the phone and black in person? But anyway,
What?
But but
I love that about you. What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
That
But-
name, David Levitt, it kind of pictures a geeky Jewish guy.
we don't get a lot of clues in the first call. But anyway, the fact that in the McCarthy era they instituted this thing, and we could go into it because it's really it's a much deeper closet than gay, than lesbian and bi, because you know, if someone said one nation under white heterosexual religious males, everyone say, hey, I object, that's not right. But if you say under God, and you better pretend you're not an atheist, which is really the message that every child gets every single day of public school unconstitutionally, then this addiction, then this routine of deception would, you know. And the truth is, I did the experiment. It was in our, Gail doesn't remember, but it was in our 7th grade class. I said,
Oh, no, I remember that we all rebelled against all of the rules.
but you didn't, there was,
I didn't know you were the starter of it. I just know that we may not
It was-
all
it was
get
kind
our
of funny because-
graduation certificate from 9th grade because we all protested that we would not say under God and we would not put our hands across our heart. And I didn't know then, you know, because we were in school 7th, 8th, and 9th grade together, David and I didn't know he was the originator of the, I mean, we were following this.
if in a way, it's the
We
same,
all felt that way.
it's the same trick that I pulled when I ran for Senate and didn't have illegal signatures like all the Republicans who run in Michigan. But I just said, they just said, who's president of class 7A1 homeroom? And everyone looked at each other and said, we don't know. I said, all right, then anyone object to me? Next thing you know, I'm class president. I said, okay, first thing, I'm not comfortable lying at the beginning of every class. Anyone else? And what was interesting was the Catholics, all of the different, you know, A, most New Yorkers are atheists. B, the Catholics were not into coercing or lying or telling anybody to pretend that they were more like them at the beginning of every class. So it was unanimous, you know, even though they, you know, eventually we found that it's also unconstitutional, but it was unanimous that this pledge is corrosive and wrong and convinces people to, you know, it convinces people not to stand up for the minority next to them to such a degree that they could be a majority and still have no voice. That's the real purpose of public school acclamation, is to say, it doesn't matter whether you have a belief, because you're told what to say you believe, hand on your heart, it's so offensive. And if there was anyone else who was serious about his beliefs, make sure everyone can see you won't ever stand up for them. And I think that people like me and you who notice shit like that when it happens and goes down are a tiny minority. Everyone else is, thank God I wasn't singled out during the blah blah, and can go on pretending to be like everyone else and not having any different ideas. And as a result, you get this stupefied culture where, you know, I think back when I was 7 and I was trying to explain that 70 years from now, this could have bad repercussions on the Supreme Court. But no, this thing of ritualized lying might be unhealthy. But anyway,
You're
anyway.
describing all of human history, David. And so this is nothing. And this is why we always think that we're somehow living in some new era. We're not. This is a cyclical thing with humans. And part of it is that we're pack animals. And so there is this built-in instinct for survival to be part of the pack, right? And you'll do what you need to do to be part of the pack. And by the way, I just want to point out now yet another like left field thing. In technologically sophisticated, successful species that are most likely based on a hive organization and not a human organization, I have a strong suspicion that if you look throughout our galaxy and find technologically sophisticated species, you're going to find that the ones that survive are the ones that have something much closer to what a bee or ant colony looks like on Earth than what humans look like, where you have much more rigid castes, you have much more conforming species, conforming to very specific niches and functions. And so those species tend to make big leaps in technology, not as frequently as humans might, but they're much more consistent, and they function less on emotion and more on logic and organization, which I suspect for evolving into a technologically sophisticated species is a prerequisite. I think that in the case of humans, where we make these big, huge leaps, but then like for every leap we make, we seem to then fall 5 steps down. This may be what we're seeing now as we very likely terminate conditions for life for our species on the planet. The planet's going to be fine. The humans are going to be fucked. And we might take some other species down with us. The planet's going to bounce back just fine. We'll self-terminate. But on the other hand, if you gave the ants long enough to evolve into something more than what they are and gave them an opportunity to do that, I suspect you'd see a technologically sophisticated species that would indeed be more in tune with the technology and less likely to use it in a destructive way. Humans, our emotions, in essence, I think are our undoing in the long term, because look at the hit, David. We're both technologists. We have to acknowledge that the easily the most important driving factor behind the development of most technologies that our species has made is the pursuit of warfare. That's the history of technology.
Was Marvin's incredibly deft manipulation of Navy budgets. Because so much of MIT and Artificial Intelligence Lab in particular, the irony or the strange thing was that Licklider and all of these incredibly smart people could not exist and were entirely funded by the military.
Absolutely. And again, just look at the history of all technology. I mean, look at shipbuilding, look at ships. Da Vinci. I mean, look at the development of the airplane, of aircraft, of the space race was a military fight with the Russians. I mean, right. Everything in our species. So my point being that when you have a species where what we see as our greatest achievement in many ways, right, the technology is mostly driven by the desire to be more efficient in destroying things, where do we think that's going to go for us? How do we think that's going to end up?
By the way, two things that came up. About the ants. My favorite Philip K. Dick story is about a guy who overhears a spider whispering in his garden and busts it, and it says, okay, okay. Truth is, the big war is going to happen tonight. Actually, ground zero is right this spot. We're tired of these fucking ants. We're going to get rid of every last one of them, and we've got the spiders, and we've got all the carnivorous reptiles and snakes on our side. Don't worry, you'll survive. And so anyway, that night, sure enough, the walls are shaking, the floors are collapsing, ants are coming up through, and the guy is sitting there in his house saying, and he sees the spider, he says, you're saying I'll survive? He says, oh, your species will survive, not you personally.
Yeah, you're screwed.
But also, I think one of the reasons, in a way you've expressed, one of the reasons you and I are somewhat immune from this conformity virus disease because of how we grew up. There's no way that the only interracial kid in Roslyn Heights, they brag about integrating their school. They're talking about me and my sister. You can't say, just pretend you're the same as everybody else. Just try not to stand out. That wasn't going to work for me. So everyone cooperated in acknowledging that I'm not like the other kids. And God, I got to discover stuff. And again, I think that there's something about the religious upbringing and the incredible number of daily lies that you fit into your brain that fills it up. And I feel like I had a brain that was empty enough that if the average child was just told the truth every day, he'd be what we now call a genius. But that's very rare.
I want to interrupt for a second here. Both David and I both were raised by atheist in atheist families. And I really do believe that not having that incredible religious filter in front is one of the reasons that I feel easier access to things, because I don't feel I have that issue to deal with. And, and it has something to do with having a more open or freer mind. And just like the rest of you two brilliant people, I have always felt different than other people in school, and I never felt like I fit in. And, I didn't have opportunities to go to other schools other than public schools. But I wonder what type of children get, what type of children you turn out when you put them in a more of a different situation where they're learning, like you, art and music. You said when you were growing up, David, and both Davids, you both got exposed to a lot of other wonderful things that, you weren't said, okay, here's a baseball and a bat, go play with your friends. You read books, you listened to music, you were artists and musicians yourselves. And I
We
think
weren't trying to get in Little League.
well, won't talk about Little League, but we do have to wind up now because we've been on our talk for some time. So what I'd like to do in the winding up is if there's any little bits of wisdom or anything you'd like to say. And since you're talking, David Levitt, let's start with you first, and then we'll finish with David Biedny, and then we'll sign off. But I have to say, if our listeners are interested and really enjoying this type of conversation, to please send us a comment and let us know that if you'd like to have more, we will have both Davids back here on the show, and we could go more in depth into other discussions with them about other topics. So Dave, what would you like to close off our listeners with?
Since I don't have anything, I'll just say, I think there was an insight there. I wasn't sure how I had met David, but it's kind of perfect that he saw this Bob Dobbs thing, because that whole thing is a celebration of questioning and shit disturbers and bringing humor to skepticism and being happy. We won't go into the subgenius philosophy. I sold so many Bibles. The founder of the church said, just call McGraw-Hill and tell them you're a publisher, and they'll send you a giant box of discount books. And I took it seriously. It was the funnest experience. But anyway, there's this. I wind up meeting people like you, and I don't know, feeling like my peers are these incredibly rare people that are themselves. And it's just so delightful and satisfying to be a part of that group that's not a group. I don't know how to describe it.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for being a guest on your wife's show. So now, David Biedny, we'd like to hear your last little words of wisdom or whatever you want to say that you'd like to send a message or whatever it is that you'd like to share with the guests.
Yeah, no wisdom. I got nothing. But I tell you, back to the subgenius thing, David. One of my most prized possessions here in the house is I have a frame print of the tree of life of this church.
You're kidding me, Gail?
Wait, hold on. I'm not done. I have this frame print from the gallery thing they had in New York City way back when.
The color one?
And the big color one. I'll take a picture and send it to you. So when I very first met Paul Mavrides, who I became very close friends with, he was at my house. He came over and signed it, and he wrote, and I'll send you a picture. It's hanging in my hallway here. He wrote, "Without lies, there can be no truth," and signed it. And I think that is it's a very instructional thing, because it sets up the duality, right? In order for there to be something that's real, you've got to be able to balance, at least as far as a bilateral brain symmetry is concerned. And I have these delusional fantasies that one day maybe humans will evolve into a trilateral brain, which would give us actual structural integrity and would be a fulfillment of the brain symmetry fitting into a Buckminster Fuller version or vision of Earth. We could have a trilateral brain. And if we had a trilateral brain, then we could probably make Mars into a really cool snack bar. And that'd be pretty cool. Because all the red iron that's there, when you mix it with sarnuvidad and a little grospissy, and you remove a bunch of and you get it with this jello, but it's not really jello, and it's like one big I forget it. That was fun.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to just say to our listeners that we're very happy to have had David and David here today with us. You know that you can listen to these shows on Spotify, Google, all your podcast platforms. You can watch on YouTube where you'll get to see a photo of the actual poster that David Biedny just told us
Oh,
about.
I'll take that picture and send it to you so you have it. for sure.
Okay, so that'll be great. And we look forward to having more of you again in the future. We'd love to have you come back because I think we have a lot here to talk about.
Well, we'll see what the listeners say. They might not be so hip on that.
Oh,
I'm
we
just
have
being
very,
realistic.
we have very grateful and wonderful listeners. So I'm expecting
Sure
to
you
hear
do.
some good comments. So thank you everyone for being here today. And remember, share your stories because sharing stories can heal. And thanks very, very much, David and David. Have a
Thank you,
great
Gail and
week.
David. Thank you.
Thank you, David.